Hello, and welcome to Entangled, the podcast where we explore the science of consciousness, the true nature of reality, and what it means to be a spiritual being having a human experience. I'm your host, Jordan Euclid, and today I'm joined by Dr. Keith Wegman as part of the first interview in the Maharishi Vedic Science miniseries. Dr. Wegman heads the Consciousness and Human Potential program at Maharishi International University, where he teaches courses in Sanskrit and MVS. Dr. Wegman is also a teacher of Transcendental Meditation and the director of TM Instruction at the Raj Ayurveda Health Spa. In this conversation, Keith defines Maharishi Vedic Sciences, MVS, and we discuss the nature of consciousness and its relationship to modern science. We next consider the distinctions between philosophy, religion, spiritual tradition, and science. From there, we discuss the perennial philosophy and the idea that there are many ways to the mountaintop. We then discuss the history of Sanskrit and how the MVS interpretation of language differs from that of modern philologists. From there, we discuss the relationship between sound value and human physiology, as well as the potential for vibratory medicine. We next discuss the relationship between name and form as it relates to vibratory consciousness. Then we consider the collective consciousness, benefits of TM, and the broken paradigm of material physiology. We end the conversation discussing the viability of world peace. Outros for this and all episodes available at entangledpodcast.substack.com. Music from the show available on the Spotify playlist Entangled the Vibes. Please enjoy.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Entangled. I'm your host, Jordan Euclid, and today I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. Keith Wegman. Keith, great to see you today, and thanks so much for joining the show.
Excellent to be here. Thanks, Jordan.
Absolutely. So Keith is a professor of Maharishi Vedic Science and Sanskrit at Maharishi International University, where I am enrolled in a master's program. And so Keith was actually the first person I was fortunate enough to meet at MIU and was really instrumental in my decision for going there. And so we're really excited today to be kicking off what is the first of a multi-part series on Maharishi Vedic Science. So as we get into that, Keith, maybe it'd be helpful if you give the folks a little bit of your background, and then we can dive into what exactly is Maharishi Vedic Science.
Excellent. It's a really good question. My name is Keith Wegman. I'm father of two teenagers, live in Fairfield, Iowa, which is the location of our university, Maharishi International University. My path into this position has been fascinating, I think. I started out as a philosophy and art major in college, looking for depth and understanding, kind of looking to find myself a little bit while I was in college. I came across a meditation practice. A good friend who, we both listened to the Grateful Dead. We were good buddies. He was meditating, and I thought, this makes a lot of sense. Let me try this. He told me it was very easy, that it was an effortless practice, something that sounded really nice to me because I had tried meditations in the past and found them to be a bit of a strain or some difficulty. So I learned how to meditate, and this was at the end of my college career, and I looked into graduate programs, and it turns out there was a university where this meditation practice, the practice of kind of transcending, was central to the studies, and it wasn't too far away from where I was in Minnesota. It was in Iowa. So it was a quick jump down. I came and took a look at the university, got really impressed, and then ended up doing a master's program and then a PhD in Sanskrit and Maharishi Vedic Science here. So after working for maybe 10 years in the private sector, nonprofit organizations, directing a Ayurveda Health Spa, things like that, I got back into academics, and for the last about 4 years now, I've been a professor here in this department in Maharishi Vedic Science in a program that we call Consciousness and Human Potential, which I think is actually a great name for the program. So that's sort of the roundabout way that I ended up in this position and doing what I do.
Fantastic. And so maybe to kick things off, for listeners who aren't familiar with, I'm sure most folks are familiar with the concept of meditation, right? Of course, at this point. But could you talk about, what makes transcendental meditation different, and where did you benefit from that practice versus some of those earlier meditation practices you tried in college with less success?
So what I found out through experience really is that the goal of meditation ultimately is to allow the mind to settle down to its quietest and calmest and most settled state, the most restful state. And in that experience, the mind actually kind of expands, becomes more and more unbounded, more and more sort of expanded. And it's a very natural experience. And what I had experienced before that, and this is through a process that we call transcendental meditation, transcending, or the mind settling like that inwardly to calmer and quieter levels, is something that many people have experienced very spontaneously and throughout time, throughout history. There are writers and thinkers and philosophers and poets that have described that process very clearly and beautifully. But then many of them describe how they haven't had a systematic way to actually come back to that experience. They had that experience and it inspires them. Maybe it becomes the basis for a lot of their scientific discoveries, things like that. But they're always wondering how we can sort of come back to that. So transcending, there's a very systematic way to bring that about called transcendental meditation. Prior to that, what I remember experiencing a few Buddhist meditations and maybe just sort of privately working out my own sort of system of meditation. I knew something about the goal of meditation was somehow to quiet the mind or become introspective in some way. And I found that to be a challenge, where sort of thoughts are always popping in. The mind is always redirecting itself in some way. So I didn't know quite how to handle that, but it turns out this procedure, at least of transcendental meditation, is to utilize the thought process in a very kind of easy way, where the mind is drawn by its own nature to these quieter and quieter levels, ultimately. And it settles down there, and then you have this very refreshing sort of inward, rejuvenating experience. You come out of meditation, you open the eyes, the world seems a lot lighter, everything's more relaxed, you have more energy, that kind of a thing. So I think early on, after I learned transcendental meditation, I found that was a very stark contrast. And the fact that it was easy and effortless just kind of blew me away. That was one of the things that really stood out. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to kind of pursue that experience inwardly, but also externally, and just find out more and more about it. What is this? What does it lead to? What am I developing through this experience and this practice? So I found that very fascinating, and that became a sort of momentum to get into this type of work and these studies. But that was the main contrast. One form of meditation was a little bit more of a strain, a little bit of sort of dodging thoughts. The other one, very effortless, very easy, utilizing the thought process to kind of go in that inward direction. So meditation, generally, I think people have an idea, it's eyes closed, something happens. But really, ultimately, I think meditation is to lead the mind to that calm and quiet and transcendental state of consciousness that everybody has. It's there within, it's already sort of in the background of our awareness. We just don't have that ability to kind of naturally to kind of just come towards that. So there's a simple technique you can learn to bring that about. So that's some ideas about how it works, I guess.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And that's certainly been my experience. I dabbled with some other meditation apps like Calm and Headspace and that kind of thing. And, they definitely were helpful in terms of relieving stress and I think, settling my mind. But at the same time, when I was doing them, it did feel very much like a chore in a way, right? Like you were having to force it into your daily routine. And then as I started to hear more about transcendental meditation and started the practice myself about a year ago, it's just been a much simpler process in a way, and I don't know exactly why for me it's been so much more effective. I certainly think having the one-on-one instruction of a TM meditation teacher versus just kind of hearing guided meditations, that was helpful, I think, as part of it, but also just I don't know. And maybe it just happened at the right time in my life where I was really open to that practice more so than when I was dabbling before. But for me, it's completely different experience in the sense that the ability to transcend, it really does feel cumulative, right? Whereas I continue in my TM practice, I feel like I get more and more out of it. I feel like it's become, in contrast to those earlier meditation practices where it felt like a chore, now it's very much the best part of my day. And I look forward to waking up to it in the morning. I look forward to doing it again in the afternoon as well. So I don't really have a question there, but that's just kind of my long-winded experience personally with the TM practice.
It's a couple of points that you make there are really important. I think that the experience is sort of self-motivating. It's refreshing. It doesn't involve intellectual analysis or no mental effort in any way. It's sort of the reduction of mental effort in a very natural way through the practice. And I think that's a big part of meditation. It's if it feels like a chore, then you're less likely to kind of make it a regular habit. And so if it's enjoyable, it's refreshing, and you notice really good results outside of meditation, I think that's a real key. The practice itself is simple, but outside with eyes open, getting into your activities, you feel more settled, a little more balanced inside generally. And so these are some of the things you mentioned. I think that's a real key.
Totally. And you mentioned for undergrad that you were studying philosophy. So I'm curious, what do you think it was that drove you to be interested in philosophy? And then what does the word philosophy even mean to you?
Yeah. I think there was a course, introductory course in philosophy at the school I went to St. Olaf College, a small school in Minnesota. And it was, I don't remember the name of the course, but I remember one of the topics that we were studying was happiness. And I'd never entertained the idea of trying to figure out what happiness is. It's fascinating to me to be in a course where we could kind of systematically think about that. And so I think that drove me to consider more what do I consider happiness. And so just that kind of, that introspective type of thinking that comes along with philosophy. I mean, philosophy is a sort of pondering of the deepest questions in life on the surface of it. It's also, philosophy means the love of wisdom, like that. So both of those were kind of very interesting to me. I didn't consider myself a natural philosopher. I never really kind of thought like a lot of the philosophers that I read, like John Stuart Mill and Heidegger and Kant and all these. But I found something in what they were saying very intriguing, and it appealed to me on a deeper level, the interest in sort of broadly understanding what life is all about. So I think philosophy just sort of entertains those crucial questions that a lot of us happen upon or come across every once in a while. Some people more often, but for everybody, there's some moments where you think, what is this? What is the meaning? What's the purpose? What's the goal of life? What is happiness? What am I after? So all these basic questions sort of hit me right at that moment in college, and then I sort of turned that into a major and sort of pursued it.
Great. And so you talked about, obviously doing your master's at MIU, where you're now a professor, and we mentioned that you're teaching both Maharishi Vedic science and Sanskrit. And so, people have likely heard of Sanskrit as a language, but don't really know the background of it. So maybe we should parse those out. Why don't we start with Maharishi Vedic science, and what does that even mean?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. The way people would often ask me that when I told them that was my major, that was my master's and PhD. And I would respond something to the effect of, it's the study of consciousness and human potential. And I think I literally used those words. And eventually we changed the name of the program, the master's program that you're in, to consciousness and human potential. So it's really the study of that. People think of Vedic science, maybe they've heard of the Vedas, or they've certainly heard of the Upanishads and the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita. These are all the sort of the literature of this ancient, what is an ancient and continuously practiced tradition of knowledge. So the Vedic tradition in India is considered by the United Nations to be the oldest continuous tradition of knowledge in the world. That means it's been practiced in the same way essentially for a few thousand years at least, or more. And so Maharishi Vedic science has the name Maharishi in front of it. Really in the last half of the 20th century, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi revived sort of the core practice, the core experience of the Vedic tradition, which is this same process of the mind settling down, experiencing its own inner nature, and then expanding. And it's a personal experience. You can have that, anybody can have that experience, but it's also, there's something very universal about it, some unboundedness, some universality about it. And that's really what Maharishi kind of opened up. He emphasized that this technique that he taught, he called it transcendental meditation. It's really a form of yoga and meditation from this ancient tradition, but he called it transcendental meditation, or TM. And it's really, he started bringing out this practice as an ideal sort of antidote to the really fast and dynamic and often chaotic and stressful pace of modern life. And that was back in the 50s. We look back at the 50s as being kind of, a more settled time, you might say. But even back then, there was plenty of stress, and maybe it's even gotten more now. So he thought, this is something I need to really teach everybody, because he noticed from the ancient tradition that there was descriptions of life as bliss, that life is really made up of bliss, or ananda. And why, if that's the nature of life, why aren't people experiencing that? So this was part of the things that drove Maharishi. So he brought out this practice, and then many, many people started to learn, ultimately millions of people. And then he went further into the understanding of this Vedic tradition. So not only sort of the core technique or technology from this ancient tradition, but then the understanding of all these different aspects of Vedic literature. And that includes the fields of Ayurveda. Ayurveda is an ancient, natural, comprehensive system of healthcare. Sthapatya Veda is an ancient, natural, holistic system of architecture. The Yoga Sutras and all the practices of yoga, pranayama, and asanas, things like that. All these things are there in this tradition. So he went very deeply and sort of located the primary position of consciousness within all these practices and understandings and bodies of literature. So he, in a sense, he really revived this ancient tradition. He sort of, for centuries it had sort of been decimated or scattered because of foreign rule and invasions and stuff throughout India. All of the techniques and traditions sort of became a little more withered and sort of broken up. And so I think what Maharishi really did is to sort of revive and refresh everything from its foundation to its applied values. So it's incredible the amount of work that he did over that time, then from the 1950s up through the early 2000s. And so that's what we teach in the program, and that you've had some experience with that. Now I think you've probably taken the Bhagavad Gita, you've looked at maybe some of the brain research, perhaps the physics. I think that's coming up for you. But so it's connecting now this ancient tradition of knowledge and science of consciousness to what is now a really fascinating and emerging field of study of consciousness in the neurosciences and the cognitive sciences in psychology and physiology. So this particular field of study is deeply, deeply ancient, but now it's really cutting edge in terms of modern science and what they're looking into.
Yeah. And I think all those confluences of ancient traditions that had been either lost or obfuscated, combined with, as we've kind of touched in the past, I think the bias of Western science and medicine to kind of dismiss everything from, non-Anglo cultures as less sophisticated, right? And so for me, you talk about the science piece of Maharishi Vedic science, right? When you look at the work that folks like Dr. John Hagelin and, Dr. Tony Nader are doing and bringing the most cutting-edge, innovative string theory and knowledge about neuroscience, and then applying to this Vedic tradition that Maharishi brought out. And, that is what shows you, like, not only are the philosophical implications huge, but also the scientific implications are just absolutely groundbreaking. And, you bring those together and recognize they're not contradictory, right? There's no spirituality or science, right? They're one and the same.
Yeah, this is a really good point. I mean, I think this is coming out more and more. The language that people have used throughout history has always been different, but many of the great thinkers and the wise of the ages are referring to the exact same thing, just using slightly different language based on where they are in the world and what their background is. But you can see in the records of history that many, many people are describing this inner reality of consciousness very closely together. So it's the same thing, just different languages being used. So that one is one of the most fascinating things. I think that you've got the spiritual and the scientific as being like two sides of the same coin. It's really just two differences of approaches to the same central reality. And that's just, it's very exciting to see what's coming out in that respect.
Absolutely. And I want to ask you some more about the Vedic tradition, in particular with its relation to what we consider, modern religions like Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism. And I think one of the, kind of getting back to that Western bias, I think another thing that people in the West or, modern society tend to think is like anything that's rooted in these ancient traditions is too much like religion. And so therefore, any scientific type person should shun it. So I guess my question is, how do you distinguish between what is Vedic tradition, what is a modern religion, and kind of where are the overlaps between those?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Vedic science and the Vedic tradition in itself is not associated with a particular religion. For long, long years, thousands of years, it was simply both a systematic understanding of nature and natural law, but also just a daily practice and a daily kind of routine. So meditation being the central experience of that tradition was never considered in terms of a religion that's separate from other religions. It was just considered a sort of a way of life, like a daily practice, like taking a walk or brushing your teeth. It was a feature of life and existence. It was a part of the educational system and a part of daily life of the people. And there was no sort of prescription or description of this as a religious practice in the way that we think about it now. We see different religions in contrast to each other. Ultimately, all religions, I think, are, if you look back at the core principles of each religion, they're all, again, describing that, be still and know that I am God, or heaven is within, all these things that Jesus spoke and others spoke. In the Tao and the Buddhist religions, all those things. So those are I think religions could be considered as just different approaches to the kind of the true underlying reality, and with different styles and different practices, perhaps. But the Vedic tradition was simply, it was really, in essence, it was very scientific, because not in the sense of Western science, where we are looking out into the world through our senses of perception, and through their extension, using microscopes and telescopes and all the modern machinery that allows for a very deep, precise look into life. But they took an inward direction. They did their exploration of the universe by, again, closing the eyes, allowing the perceptual apparatus to settle down along with the mind and probe deeper values that way. So it's in essence, then, I think it's a real scientific tradition, but also very practical, looking at the big picture in life. Now, in terms of modern day sort of Hinduism and things like that, there is certainly a big overlap. But I think even Hinduism these days doesn't quite fit in the same category. It's a very open, as I understand it, my wife is Hindu. It's a very open, very accepting, very inclusive form of religion, in that it does recognize all other religions as just different pathways to God or to the highest value, highest potential. So it's not, I think fundamentally it's not in distinction or in conflict with any other religion for that reason. It sort of sees everything as approaches to the deepest reality. But it has, in many ways, there are parts of it now that have set up, sort of these distinctions and maybe conflicts, seeing, conflicts maybe between Islam and Hinduism, sort of on the Indian subcontinent. But those, like many sort of modern religions, sometimes are missing the fundamental core principles. They're sort of forgotten those basic values that are there, and so anyway, those are some contrasts. But I think that's one of the unique things that I've learned, is that Hinduism, like the Vedic tradition, is open to all these different approaches, because it sees them all as valid ways to the top of the mountain, as it were. So some thoughts there.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And that philosophy or kind of understanding of the spiritual traditions really was instrumental for me personally in terms of my philosophical development. Because, I definitely grew up, my mom was Catholic, my dad was Jewish, I had a bar mitzvah, but was never, too firmly steeped in any spiritual tradition, and certainly had a negative, and I'd say I still tend to have a pretty negative overall view of organized religion, and especially ones that say, you have to worship my God, and if you take any other God as your own, well, then you deserve to be murdered, right? That never made any sense to me. And then you kind of talk about some of these ideas and this kind of theme of the perennial philosophy that you've seen philosophers bring out, and, in the Rig Veda, truth is one, the wise call it many names, and really starting to explore for myself what a lot of these spiritual leaders like Maharishi, like the Buddha, like Jesus, were actually saying, and not the message that's been transmitted to us by the folks who run the kind of the organized religions that have kind of appropriated the spiritual traditions. And then you see, oh wow, there actually is much, much more in common with all these spiritual traditions than there is in conflict.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point, Jordan. I think anybody that looks closely at some of the, the real foundational texts and writings and experiences of the founders and of these various religions will ultimately kind of see these same things. They'll see these core principles coming out and realize that, this idea of any conflict or of exclusivity, maybe even, isn't really necessary. It'd be like saying, this language is the only language and everybody should speak this language. All the different languages are beautiful. They all reflect, different cultures and climates and geographies and things like that. So it's silly to take an exclusionary approach, and that was always one of my issues as well growing up. I didn't feel like that was right. It just didn't seem like a value that made sense to me. And so I think that, anybody that takes a deep look, if they really want to do it, they'll see these same ideas coming out, and that's a beautiful experience if you come across that.
Absolutely. And so, talking about language, let's get into Sanskrit. Maybe first, what is Sanskrit according to maybe the traditional study of linguistics, and then how has Maharishi's interpretation of the Sanskrit language influenced, your interpretation of it as well?
Yeah. So there's kind of the discovery of Sanskrit by the Western philologists and linguists. That's a fascinating story. So I'll mention that, and then sort of the deep inner value of Sanskrit, which we study in the program, which is really also fascinating. So in the West, due again to foreign invasions and things like that of India, Western scholars became interested in seeing what these various bodies of knowledge from the Vedic literature contained. And there was many sort of German schools and seats of learning. There's Oxford in England, which has a seat of Sanskrit and a long-standing tradition studying the Indian cultures. So they discovered these ancient texts that were part of an oral tradition that is still maintained, a passing on of knowledge just through speech between a teacher and a student, and the student sort of repeating and then embodying that knowledge and then passing it on eventually to other students. But eventually that all became written down. There's these same sort of sets of language, of text, I wouldn't say of text, but of spoken language that eventually was written down in order to sort of preserve it, to make sure that it would be sustained even if there wasn't a physical speaker that could pass it on orally. So these texts were produced originally on palm leaves. You take palm leaves and then they cut them into these sort of thin horizontal strips. You take like an iron filing and they etch the Sanskrit or the Devanagari script into the palm leaves, and then they cover it with some kind of oil-based charcoal and then wipe that clean, and it leaves these sort of etches of the text. And so then they stack those up so that all of this immense oral tradition was committed mostly to a written script on these palm leaves. And then eventually with book production and things like that, they were made into books. And so, so these English and German primarily scholars became fascinated with what they were learning and what kind of knowledge existed there. And so they had people go down and gather books and bring them back, and they learned Sanskrit, they learned the Sanskrit grammar, they learned how to translate the ancient Sanskrit texts into English, into German, into Russian, or whatever the case might be. So they became experts in the grammar and vocabulary of the language. And then eventually wrote down their sort of translations of things. And then those books became available, after sort of Gutenberg and the printing presses, and all these books were available to the public and to academics. And more people, I think, began to read these translations and become fascinated. But then there was a certain subset that looked actually at the philologists or the linguists that looked at the structure of the language. Many of them came to the conclusion that Sanskrit was some deep relative of Greek and Latin. And by way of Greek and Latin, that meant also German, also French, Spanish, Italian, and all this sort of the Western languages. And then eventually people discovered that connection of Sanskrit to Eastern languages like Pali and Tibetan and all kinds of other things. So these philologists or linguists looked at the language in that way, and then actually discovered that the the grammarian, the original sort of grammarian of Sanskrit, his name is Panini, wrote what they felt was this incredible opus of grammatical principles that describe the language in such precision and how the language is derived from certain verbal roots, very simple 1 or 2 syllable roots. Now we have sort of the Indo-European roots that have been derived as a kind of a synthesis of all kinds of religions. Nobody actually ever spoke Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European. It's just sort of a sort of gathering of all those things into one sort of single. Anyway, so you've got all these roots that then from which you derive words and verbs and nouns and participles and all kinds of things. And so Panini is seen as this sort of giant in terms of linguistics. Everybody that studies grammar or linguistics knows about Panini. He's still considered sort of the preeminent grammarian. And Panini himself was part of this Vedic tradition, so he actually felt that his writings were simply committing to text what he had cognized internally. So he sort of didn't come up with these ideas of grammar intellectually, as if you were thinking, sitting around and thinking, well, okay, let me create a language. Actually, like Tolkien and others did a great job, creating the language of Middle Earth and stuff. Fascinating. So the human intellect can create amazing things, but this is beyond even just an intellectual approach to language. He felt and described again that inner transcendental experience, becoming familiar with that settled state of consciousness, and then beginning to see how that state is actually vibrating in terms of sound values. Then these sound values ultimately give rise to physical forms and the material forms of the universe. So he was seeing language from that level. The Western philologists and linguists were seeing it as just an incredible, mathematically precise version of language. So Sanskrit has this, position really as being seen as sort of very central to the tree of language, especially in the West, but I think even throughout the East, very much at the root of all languages. There's some debate about whether it's at the root or up a little bit further. Maharishi himself calls it the language of nature. And for just this reason that Panini ultimately describes, is that it's the language, it's the vibratory modes of consciousness. And that our consciousness, your consciousness, my consciousness, the field of consciousness underlying everything, has to sort of construct the universe that we perceive in some way. And the Vedic description is that this ultimately happens through impulses, initially through impulses of sound, vibrations of sound that can be perceived within consciousness and then spoken out, and that's what the Vedic rishis, the ancient Vedic seers did. They perceived it inwardly. They never take individual credit for it. And they were like, this is my discovery. I found this. No, they say that this is simply my perception of a universal level of life that's already there. So then they just sort of express it. And then, so this brings us now to our approach at MIU to Sanskrit, which is very phonetic based. It's very much sound value. It's just effortlessly speaking the sounds, has a therapeutic effect. It has a developmental influence. It seems to, according to brain research, produce the kind of brainwave coherence that is similar to the meditation practice. And so just the practice of reciting syllable by syllable in the sequence that the Vedic literature unfolds seems to activate some very special kind of latent structure or functioning within the physiology. And there's been a lot of great research by Dr. Tony Nader to show that all the impulses that are there in the Vedic sounds, the Vedic literature, actually are present within the structure and functioning of different aspects of the physiology. And so you can kind of see now how there's a very fascinating practice of just speaking the sounds, reciting the sounds, enlivening those values of structure and functioning within the physiology to remind the physiology of its own inherent universal value. Sort of anywhere in the physiology where there's some imbalance or lack of proper functioning or disorder, if you introduce these sounds, either by sort of listening to them or speaking them out in a very easy and effortless way, then you sort of are re-enlivening the initial and original design of the physiology. And so that sort of counteracts any disorder, any imbalance. So there's repercussions for this. There's potential research that could go into listening to or speaking the sounds of the Vedic texts and actually healing the physiology from within by simply enlivening what's already there, not introducing something foreign to the physiology, but simply regenerating it from within somehow through sound. So, I mean, in a nutshell, we teach the basics of the Sanskrit alphabet, all the 48 letters, 50 letters roughly, of those, how to put those sounds together, and then how to recite, the different scripts and texts of the Vedic literature with this knowledge in mind that it's already sort of within us, within the field of consciousness, within the physiology. So there's so many possible and potential applications for that in the field of health, in the field of education, and just in human development generally. So I think it's another amazing aspect of this program.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's such important points to bring out, and especially, as it relates to human health and that kind of thing. And, it definitely mirrors a lot of the other, kind of sound technology work being done in the broader consciousness community in terms of we think these specific frequencies can help these parts of the body. It also plays, like acupuncture, that kind of thing. And I think it, again, for the folks who maybe come from more of a materialistic, reductionist worldview, this can sound like that's crazy, right? How could Sanskrit words impact your body? But I think this again gets into just how profound, what Maharishi's teaching showed, and the importance of a consciousness-based cosmology in terms of the impact of as above, so below, and that, this, as you talk about, right, the belief that that Sanskrit is more than just this language, but it's rather almost like a mathematical code that is the underlying structure of the cosmos, of which each and every human being is a relatively small, independent subtotality of this bigger macro that we live in. That's
really well stated. Yeah, it's. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, vibratory medicine is really an expanding field. All different kinds of sounds, frequencies, general frequencies, but also language-based sounds, music. All these things are being sort of tested with physiology and seeing what's happening in the brain, and I think more and more things are going to come out there. But you touched upon something there that I think is absolutely right. I think this is ultimately this understanding of Sanskrit, the understanding of consciousness and its relationship to matter, is sort of a real revolution in the paradigm. It's sort of, we obviously live in a material world. We know that matter exists, on some level. We can feel it, we can touch it, taste it, everything like that. But what physics is telling us, the deepest physics these days, is that matter is ultimately immaterial, that there is no particular fundamental brickwork or building block that structures everything, the atomic theory. It's actually fields of intelligence, non-material fields that percolate and become particles, and the particles, congregate and sort of become the forms of the universe. So if you examine it even from the modern physical level, the material universe seems to disappear at fundamental levels. And so that's right in line with this understanding that consciousness is fundamental, that it's ultimately consciousness, awareness, intelligence that fashions itself and sort of molds itself into all the infinite variety of objects and material forms in the universe. And so this, I keep thinking about this in terms of our program, is that it's a study in a completely new, but obviously very ancient paradigm of understanding. It's flipping the script. And when you switch it around, both things still remain, but now you're seeing this side of it, maybe the material side, from a completely new perspective. And so all kinds of new values, understandings, and directions and purposes can be sort of understood and fathomed from that new perspective. And I think that's one of the more exciting aspects of this program and this knowledge that's been sort of coming out in so many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious, in your time, the last few decades with MIU and consciousness, the study of consciousness more broadly, have you seen it gain more broader acceptance and kind of, not necessarily just being relegated to this like fringe branch of philosophy, to actually folks treating this as a legitimate field of scientific inquiry?
Yeah, absolutely. It's night and day. When I started studying this, it was in the early 90s. And meditation, even yoga at that stage, was still considered a little bit sort of peripheral, out there, because a little unique, and it's certainly not mainstream. But you go anywhere these days, even small towns, even churches like my church where I grew up, the Lutheran church up in Minnesota, teaches yoga classes, and yoga is sort of branched out and sort of expanded into so many different ways and things like that. So yoga, meditation, you see mindfulness, you see it on just about every other magazine cover these days, somebody with their eyes closed. And so it's very much in the collective consciousness. And I think part of that is, with anything, with any paradigm shift, it's a generational thing. I think my generation, your generation, we're all part of the same generation, really, but is sort of really open to all of these ideas. And I think that's what's being reflected now in how many people are participating and looking into these types of yoga, meditation. Ayurveda now is like I realize now in 2022, I don't really have to explain Ayurveda that much to people. And certainly not yoga. They just kind of know what it is. They've seen products. So it's really night and day. And I think it's sort of the development, the interest in these topics is increasing exponentially. And that's really exciting. Because these things are really, truly valuable. The restfulness that you gain in meditation, the flexibility, the development of the physical nervous system that you gain through yoga, the simple and natural techniques of herbs and things that are brought about in Ayurveda. All of these things are very simple, very natural, and very kind of common sense, and you just sort of make use of them. I just think about my own experience and how much explanation was required back in the early days when I sort of first discovered and started studying these things. Just generally, with my family, that had its own thing, but just in general, what do you do? What is this? What is meditation? And now it's, people have a really good general idea. I think most everybody's tried something, some mindfulness, some meditation, some yoga, and even Ayurveda these days is really there's not much of a bridge that you have to make to describe what Ayurveda is, because there's lots of it going on in products and herbs and practices and treatments and things like that. So it's very kind of exciting and liberating, to sort of already have for most people already have a sort of basis of understanding, and you don't have to really go into a lot of detail. You can sort of get into the good parts of it, but it's definitely, there's a shift there for sure. And I think, younger people and people middle age, even older people are more and more open to it. Maybe it's because there really seems to be a lot of stress and anxiety and depression and things like that. Maybe the contrast now is a little more stark, and the idea of practices and techniques of deep rest and relaxation and inner development and that kind of a thing it's just more striking. It's more interesting because perhaps, the way things are right now in society, or just perhaps because it's been building, it's a shift that's sort of been working its way into the forefront of awareness over decades. So whatever the reason is, it's an exciting time for all these things that we're looking at and studying, and we need it. And it's really necessary. We need leaders and people that can describe the potential and actually teach and do what you're doing. You're podcasting, and I know you're creating your book, and just getting this really inspiring and practical knowledge out into the collective consciousness. Let people, whoever's there, can grab it and start using it, because it's really like collectively, I think we're all gonna, sort of come together on this and really start to change things, not individually, but in society. So it's an exciting time.
Yeah, it definitely is. And you mentioned, your path in terms of, even with your family and then having to explain what you were studying at MIU. And I'm curious, what has that journey been like? Did you feel like you're almost like on the defensive of having to explain, why this is a career path that you're interested in?
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. My family, for the most part, could see that this was a university and a meditation technique that was founded by a yogi. There's pictures of Maharishi, and he's a definite kind of traditional yogi. And so that was the first hurdle, with the family. It was sort of, what is this? And for them, that was a sort of a big deal. It sort of brought to mind all kinds of things. And, and so the explanation and the connection with them was a good challenge at first. I had to mention that it's certainly not a religion. It's not it's not in any way kind of a lifestyle. It is something you have in your daily routine when you meditate and all that. But it's not any of the sort of trappings that they were sort of seeing in that sort of picture of some organization founded by a yogi. I think it's unfortunate that was something that had to be overcome, but it is what it is. Everybody's coming at it from their own angle. So, but eventually my whole family learned how to meditate. My dad, ex-Marine, he meditates regularly and really loves it. And I think it's helped him out immensely. I taught my mom and sister. And for me, that was really fulfilling. And ultimately, those kind of things fell away. Those sort of things that normally would have sort of been barriers for them or obstacles, just didn't matter in the way that they thought it did. So that's, that was kind of a fun challenge at first, but I think, again, generally people are seeing everything in a different light now. This was, a few decades ago when I learned how to meditate. So.
And what do you think it was about Sanskrit in particular that was so interesting to you?
I would say two things. I would say the experience of the kind of, like you were saying, the mathematical precision and logic of the language was just fascinating. In the same way that a beautiful algorithm or something, that works is fascinating to look at how it works. But the structure of it and the sound value of it, right away we learned how to read it, and practice it, and just pronouncing the alphabet. There was something really fundamental and something really resonant about it. So that was what first sort of jump-started my interest. It was this sort of visceral experience of Sanskrit. And then I was always interested in languages and sort of the source of languages. I took Latin in college. Would have loved to study more Greek. But to see it's, just in terms of the practical utility of understanding like Latin, if you know Latin, then you can almost figure out just about every other English word and how it's derived and what its meaning is, or what its original meaning may have been. So language has always been fascinating to me. And then to discover that Sanskrit is seen as this really ultimate sort of original language or foundational language was very fascinating on that level as well.
Yeah, totally. And I think when you talk about, the relationship between Sanskrit and Greek and other Western languages, I definitely noticed that right away as we were learning it in class last semester, just the similarities in the shapes and that sort of thing between Sanskrit and Greek, just from having seen the Greek alphabet. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on, do you see a relationship between Sanskrit and maybe some of the other Eastern Eastern languages like Chinese and Japanese, where you don't have like a set character count, but more like each character is its own word? Or do you think those are fundamentally different types of languages?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly more of a, what do they call it, sort of visual. It is different. I think there's definitely a relation there when you consider the words in sound value. There's a lot of words that cross over, like the word in Sanskrit for consciousness is chit, like C-H-I-T, chit. And in China, they have the word chi. And so that, describing that foundational principle, which is consciousness as well. So you have these, on the phonetic level, there's much less difference. On the sort of textual or the level of the characters or the script, it's there's a wide variety there. When you look at Chinese, when you look at Japanese, it's fascinating. It's beautiful language, and those characters represent, I think, more visual forms, I think, is the idea. Sanskrit, the text is most likely very visual, but maybe on an abstract, deeper level. I haven't quite cracked the code yet of the script, of the Devanagari script. I think it's a fascinating kind of a thing. The connection between the letters, you can see some between the Arabic or the Roman letters and Sanskrit. You can see some relationships. Obviously, you've got the line that goes through all the different sounds, the horizontal line, that being the really unique feature of Sanskrit, which I think that line represents the thread of consciousness that goes through all various diverse forms of it is just that central thread, connecting thread is consciousness. But I think basically on the level of sound, I think a lot of the Eastern languages also are deeply tied and must be fundamentally related to Sanskrit. As you move east from India, you see more and more connection, and then it sort of becomes a little less and less as you move further east. But phonetically, I think they're ultimately very close, like that.
That makes sense. And one of the things that we learned about Sanskrit last semester that I found super fascinating, I'm sure I'm going to butcher this explanation, but my understanding is like kind of in traditional modern society, we assign words to things and we think that the label is the thing. But Sanskrit, at least Maharishi's interpretation of it, is that script kind of needs to be flipped, right? That the sound value, the tone, the noise itself in Sanskrit is what you're describing, and the closer you get to matching the sound value and whatever it is that you're perceiving in the realm of the senses, that connection relates to what we were talking about earlier in terms of like the closer you are in both sound value and form, the more that connection between the language and what you're describing is felt. I'm sure that's a terrible explanation, but wanted to ask you a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, you did a good job describing it. This is what's called the nama rupa relationship, or the name form. Name is nama, rupa is form. And in Sanskrit, there's considered to be a one-to-one relationship between those two things. Like all the physical forms of the universe also have a vibrational value. It's the name of them or the sound of them. And that sound corresponds to the inner value of the form. The form is just an expression of the sound, in the same way that material forms in this understanding or paradigm are the expression of vibratory modes of consciousness. So it's the vibratory value that is consistent both in the name and the form. And so you have, in speaking Sanskrit, you speak the names, and because the name and the form are connected completely, you enliven the form. When you speak the name, you enliven the form. And so there's the effect of that. If you're just speaking these sounds, you're enlivening the form, whether it's a form in the physiology or something like that. So that's interesting. But this is in distinction to a language in which a particular form, you start with a form and then you apply a name that's maybe not necessarily tied to the vibrational quality of that form, but a name like a sort of a conventional name, something that people just utilize because they all agree that this is what we called it. It's a name that's been applied to this object. And that's how we normally consider language. We feel like somewhere in the past, objects were sort of called a particular way because some person did that first and then it carried on, something like that. Everybody agrees upon the conventional naming of things. But in Sanskrit, that is obviously kind of different. Then you've got the names that are inherently connected to the form. And so you have the ability to sort of, in one sense, you have the ability to kind of manifest the form by speaking the name. Like if you, in a way, it's a very efficient value of language, because if you have the ability to communicate in this way, you would sort of naturally evoke the quality of the form in the name, and the other person receiving, the listener, might feel it. Anyway, there's some really fascinating implications of that understanding of a natural language in which the name and the form are combined. But I think you spoke that out quite well. Your memory from this spring is good.
No, thank you. It was really cool even just starting to practice, in supplementing TM to listening to the Vedic Pandits, reciting Sanskrit. And there are even times when I'd be listening to Sanskrit where you could feel a certain part of your body being impacted. And that was a really wild phenomenon for me.
Yeah, that is striking when it happens. It's and there's a lot of Vedic literature out there. You might have listened to what's called the Veda app. There's an app on the Mac store, and then on the Google app thing too. Lots of different recitations from all the different aspects of the Vedic literature, each of them with its own inherent quality and sort of enlivens a particular form, like we were talking about the sound and the physiology having that connection. So it's not surprising. And this is some of the great research that's taking place here at the university in terms of brain research, is finding that, just listening to these sounds, which anybody can do. You have to learn and be trained a little bit initially in speaking and reading Sanskrit. But anybody can listen to these sounds. In fact, one of our students who is a military veteran, felt like this would be an ideal thing to apply for veterans with PTSD, because she had such a profound experience with it. Just listening, it's almost like that transcending experience. It's sort of, it does something, it induces some relaxation or sort of balancing of the physiology. And so she feels like, let's give this to veterans. You'd have to explain to them what they're listening to. But so this is a huge new field. I mean, I think the potential there is immense, and you've already kind of had some experiences with it. So it's something that everybody should have a chance to try out.
And I think a similar phenomenon that is just as mind-boggling, if not more so, is the whole idea of collective consciousness, which you were touching on earlier, and not even in the metaphorical sense, which I think a lot of people have probably heard of that idea, collective conscious, collective subconscious, whatever, but actually in the scientific physical properties of field effects of consciousness, that group meditation is not just some placebo effect, but in fact the combined effects of resonating in that positive, well-intentioned light, like that, it actually magnifies the impact of your thoughts. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that understanding.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And you've got a class coming up in the spring called Collective Consciousness and Leadership. I think you're going to love it. The idea is, if consciousness is a field and we're all immersed in that field, we're all individual expressions of that field, that everything we do and speak and say and act and behave is a projection into the field. And so if many, many people are stressed, anxious, then the field will sort of reflect that. The collective consciousness will reflect that. As more and more people meditate and experience that inner field directly, then you see there's more peace, there's more rest, there's more happiness, there's less depression. And the more and more people that meditate together as a group, then the more that collective consciousness reflects the inner value of that field. So everybody, that's the main point, that everybody individually is sort of influencing the field in their own particular way for better or worse, whether it's stressed or projecting peace and happiness. So that's a principle, but it doesn't take everybody to meditate to produce a really positive influence. Just a small percentage of people in any population. The U.S. has about 300 million people. It turns out maybe 30,000 people meditated together, you could have this really significant influence. It's called a 1% effect, or some scientists have called it the Marshi effect. As he predicted in 1960, if just 1%, or I think 10% at that time, meditated, then that influence would spread. That peacefulness, that restfulness, that orderliness would percolate more in society. And so eventually some scientists decided to measure that. And up until now, there's been something like 50 really rigorous scientific research experiments on the effects of group meditation on a surrounding area or a country or even the world, depending on the size of the group. And that can only happen if consciousness is a pervasive field, because in some of these research studies, there's a large group of people meditating in one place, but hundreds of miles away, they're seeing influences like reduced crime, reduced hospitalizations, greater cooperation, more patents for new inventions, and on the positive side. So the results are just amazing. And one thing, I don't know if you've done this, but there's a group meditation every day with Bob Roth, who's one of the big kind of meditation teachers. Yeah. And so you call in, you sit down, close eyes, you meditate, and there's like 4,000 or 5,000 people on those calls that are meditating at the same time. And those are kind of the criterion that scientists have found produces this effect. And if there's a group of meditators generally in one place, but and that place can be spread out now and sort of so it's a very important kind of social tool that needs to be brought out. There's certain congressmen and women that have picked up on it, and I think because the collective consciousness is kind of evolving towards this deep understanding, more of an understanding of the inner value of life, I think more and more you'll start to see proposals for this, and hopefully that'll catch fire. In fact, the military, the U.S. military is planning on, they're doing research, a study right now, it's called a phase 3 research, where they've got almost 1,000 people involved in it. And they've, based on their preliminary work with veterans and active personnel, it may be very soon that you see a peace-creating sort of part of the military. Individuals that are not trained or merely trained for battle or for conflict, but that are meditating together and actually creating an influence of orderliness, peace, harmony, sort of strength for the country by meditating together. It's an amazing thing, and it seems like we're getting very close to that. I think more and more people are open to the idea and putting money into it. The U.S. government is paying for active military personnel to learn TM, and so we're on the cusp of taking advantage of this field that we're all a part of, in this particular way to promote peace and cooperation and all that.
I think that's really cool. And, and you talk about the military, I think also in terms of like traditional healthcare, like for me, it can be pretty mind-boggling why we continue to have such a broken healthcare system with skyrocketing costs. People are not getting healthier. And then you look at, some of the research we read last semester, just from the results of TM, some of the work that, Dr. Travis has been doing, and like, it's unbelievable, right? For a very small cost, you can start this daily practice that has just unbelievable results from the physiological perspective, from, reactivating your IQ, from intelligence, creativity. Like, it's just, and I've experienced it directly just in the last year. So I guess, what I'm getting at is like, with all that positive results, with the relatively low cost of meditation, versus traditional healthcare, why don't you think we've made more progress at this point?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't have a straightforward answer. I mean, everybody knows the adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And like you said, meditation, currently TM is maybe a few $100 to take the whole course, and it's a lifetime course with follow-up, and just for that course fee. And then there's programs through the David Lynch Foundation and other things that help provide the funds. So people give to the donation, and that pays for teachers to teach inner city students and homeless and Native Americans and stuff how to meditate. But yeah, it's frustrating in a way, because I think it is a paradigm shift. I think the idea that closing the eyes without anything else other than your own physiology, there's no food, there's no herbs. I mean, there's no medicine, there's no apparatus of medical treatment or therapy. It's just simply making use of the physiology in a way that the physiology fully enjoys and gets replenished by. Marsha says it's like watering the root of a tree. The tree has so many branches, like you mentioned, all parts of life. You got personality, psychology, physiology. You've got your social relationships. You've got your work and all that. All these are branches of the tree that we all try to attend to individually, but just through one simple procedure of watering the root of the tree, all these things tend to flourish and become healed and all that. So the idea that there's something so simple and non-material that can be done, that can be so effective on the level of prevention and on the level of development, is still a sort of a big leap. It's sort of a jump for people to get to that if they're not maybe inclined or understanding of it. So it's still there, but that gap is probably shrinking little by little. And I think more people are, for whatever reason, will come to meditation, as their doctor might tell them. They might get to a point where the doctor just says, you know what, this has been found to be really effective to reduce anxiety and stress. It's been found to be really effective to increase productivity, those kind of things. You should try it. And many doctors are doing this now. They're learning, they've looked at the research. So people might hear it from their doctor. They might find it on their own. They might be listening to a podcast like this or reading a book, and something makes sense, and they can try it. And I even think I think people could try. They can learn TM, and there's even a satisfaction guarantee. I mean, if you can just try the practice, see how simple it is and what the experience is like, and if you don't enjoy that, then you get your money back. And it's kind of an amazing offer, in the meditation field, but it just shows really how effective it is. And I think everybody that tries it will see how beneficial it is. But it's a jump. It's still sort of a jump. And especially, if you're talking about modern medicine and modern medical education, there's a strong emphasis on the materiality of the physiology. And it's still rooted in 19th and 18th century science, that this is a physical universe made up of physical building blocks, that if you adjust or manage some of the chemical building blocks, you can alter the physiology for better or for worse. It's the allopathic model, and that has to shift, and that's sort of what we're seeing, hopefully, and that can maybe be accelerated the more knowledge and information gets out.
I hope so. And it feels like it is accelerating. I'm in Colorado, so, I think we have a lot of that community in particular, but even still, I see it happening countrywide.
Yeah, that's right. Colorado, you're in a great place for that. I wouldn't say everybody. I know there's two sides out there. There's the sort of, both sides, but it's very easy to sort of introduce these ideas in Colorado and have a receptive audience. Yeah,
totally. Well, Dr. Wegman, this has been such a fun conversation. Before I let you go, I wanted to end the conversation talking to you about world peace. And you talked about Maharishi's analogy of watering the root to flourish the plant, and that has always really resonated with me. And I think similarly, he's kind of used that same analogy with regards to world peace, right? Of, TM being a way to plant the seeds, and then the more people who practice it, it branches off in unexpected ways. But the end goal, or hopefully, the end of the collective dharma here, is to get to a point where we have no more violence and no more war, and we collectively as humans can transcend to a higher state of consciousness, to a collective state of enlightenment or ascension or whatever you want to call it. And I think, you mirror up that philosophy with where the world is today, right? And unfortunately, it looks like we're probably closer to World War III than we maybe have ever been, at least since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so I guess my question is, where do you stand on the practicality of us achieving world peace? Do you think it's still possible and a worthy goal worth striving for, or is it, have we missed the boat on that?
Yeah. I mean, I love the question. I think it's very plausible. I think the research bears it out. I think there is a shift. I think although the world situation feels a little bit precarious right now on the surface, my personal reaction to war, for example, in the Ukraine, was how anachronistic it felt. Just how unnecessary, and how unusual. I mean, I know this gets into other issues, and wars have come up throughout the world for various reasons. But to me and family and stuff, it's sort of surprising. Like, is this really an approach to gaining territory. Does it work? And it doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem to make sense. But I think, I think world peace is absolutely a laudable goal. It's attainable. It seems overwhelming to think, how can we bring this about? How are people actually going to get together and live peacefully together and recognize each other as a left hand and a right hand of the same body of consciousness? It seems crazy that the right hand would injure the left hand. You wouldn't think that would be anything you would do. And that's because, those two things are connected. But if you don't recognize that or experience that, then there can be conflict. It doesn't, you can see the conflict between these things. So I think the idea is that through understanding that we're living in a universe of consciousness, the expression of a field of consciousness that is pervasive throughout all of us. We're all expressions of that same field. There's a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, for someone who is enlightened, who sees the self in all beings and all beings in the self. So as enlightenment develops, as human potential is unlocked and realized more and more, individuals and collective individuals, societies, communities, countries, begin to recognize the other as an extension of one's own self. And so, racial disparities, ethnic disparities, political disparities, all these things don't reflect the true reality. And as that reality dawns, it dawns in experience first. So as many people that can learn how to transcend and promote peace within themselves, and then collectively meditate together, preferably in large groups. And we're always trying to create a large group here in Fairfield, but anywhere in the world we can create groups. Then that harmonious, peaceful, coherent influence that's reflective of the nature of reality will percolate more and more in everybody's awareness. More people will recognize, one day you look at somebody as your sort of enemy that you're in conflict with. The next day, without any explanation, you find that they're just almost, they're like your family. You want to protect them as much as you want to protect yourself. So these are the types of realizations that will dawn as consciousness is developed individually and again collectively. So I think, and the research is there, like we were saying earlier. It's still a paradigm shift or a jump for people to recognize it, but since the scientific research has been at least established the principle of it, it doesn't take much for somebody to maybe fund or look at a larger study or a government to create a group to see the effects of this. And I think when people see the effects, if there's a model of it somewhere in the world, perhaps, then other governments will see it, other communities will see it, and then there'll be a snowball effect. And I think it could happen very quickly, and we need that. The climate needs it, and so let's make it happen.
Yep.
What can you say?
Yeah, let's make it happen. And I think as you talk about the research, I mean, it really is there. It's just, been overlooked by people, I think. But, you talk about the Maharishi effect and some of the research that was done. I believe what was it was a conflict between Israel and Lebanon, right? In the early 1990s?
Yep.
Could you talk a little bit about that study?
Yeah, sure. I believe that study was, it was very thorough. The sort of the p-value on that study was like 1 in 200 million, which means that the possibility that the results of that study were due to coincidence or chance is less than 1 in 200 million or something. I forget how many decimal points. It was dramatic, and it showed the real rigorous nature. The researchers up to that point had learned a lot from previous studies and applied all this sort of scientific techniques like time series analysis to this particular study. But it basically showed that there was a group of people meditating in Israel, I think, or in Lebanon, either side. And as the number of people increased, if you're looking at a chart, the number of people in the group increased, then the negativity in the war deaths and conflicts at that time, it was an all-out war between Lebanon and Israel, then those negative values decreased. And then as the size of the group decreased, then those negative values kind of went back up. As the size increased, the negative values went down. So you see this correlation following through time. And that particular study, I think, was accepted into the Journal of Conflict Resolution. It's Yale University's sort of one of the top journals in the field of social research. And the editor and some of the people on the peer, it's a peer-reviewed journal. And so there are professionals in the field of conflict management and international conflict that looked at the results of this study. Many of them objected to the study because they couldn't see how a possible mechanism. It didn't make sense that, how does this work? It doesn't, people closing their eyes and war deaths going down. But when all the other factors, possible factors were sort of reduced and sort of eliminated from the explanation, the editor said, with some apprehension, we had to publish this study because the science was sound and the results were arrived at very systematically. And even though we don't necessarily understand it, we feel compelled to produce it. So it was published in that particular journal. And then, and there were, all kinds of reactions from that. Sort of awe and wonder probably from many people in the field, a stern sort of resistance to it, obviously, because it's nothing anybody could have conceived of. One of my good friends, Dr. Carla Brown, she works in Chicago and teaches meditation and does some other things. She did her doctorate at Harvard University on this particular subject as to when there's research that is sound, but it's sort of beyond the sort of the paradigm thinking of the field. What is the reaction to that? What would cause somebody to object to sound research that didn't make sense but was still sound? So her dissertation is all about that. Dr. Carla Brown, I forget the name of the dissertation, but she looked at those factors that would cause resistance in some people to the acceptance of that, and it was fascinating. So those are the things. That was back I think in the mid to late 1980s. So it's been a long time since then, and I'm not sure. I'm kind of curious what the reactions would be if that particular study came out again or was sort of republished. But I think we'd probably see a slightly different reaction to it. Maybe some more openness, perhaps.
Well, I'll make sure to post a link to that study in the show notes. Any other recommendations you have for folks who are maybe interested in a Consciousness and Human Potential program or the TM program?
Yeah, sure. I mean, miu.edu, very simple. We've got a great website, lots of good detailed knowledge. If you want to look into this program, there's descriptions of all the courses. Online, it's about a 2.5 to 3 year program. On campus, it's a 1 year full-time program, and then we have a PhD in that as well for anybody that really wants to dig deeply into it. TM.org is a great website. That's the sort of national website for transcendental meditation. I think davidlynchfoundation.org is fabulous. You can see what a lot of teachers are doing in crisis-prone populations throughout the U.S. and around the world. The effect of meditation to solving some really entrenched problems and issues. But those would be good places to start, and I think you could find other connections to that. But take a look at that, and we are always, as you know, Jordan, we had a good conversation before we even started the program. So I'm happy to talk to people if they want to contact the admissions department at MIU. or just look us up. We're actually going to be starting, like I mentioned, a podcast. We'll be putting our productions onto the website just so you'll hear more about some of the topics that we spoke about today. But anyway, we're really excited and have great students like yourself who are really looking deeply and bringing the world some really fascinating new perspectives. And anyway, so I'm really happy we could meet today and let's do some more.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Dr. Wegman, and thank you, for running such an incredible program. It's been just so mind-opening and fun, and I've really enjoyed getting to meet all my classmates and teachers thus far into the program, and only a semester in, so excited to see what the winter has in store.
Yeah, beautiful. Excellent, Jordan. Well, yeah, we'll talk soon.
Absolutely. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks so much.
Sound is vibration. Vibration is sound. Sound is vibration. Vibration is sound.
Thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. One of my favorite aspects of Maharishi Vedic science is that it has caused me to flip many preconceived notions I took for granted. The true nature of sound and language being one case in point. Sound is vibration. Vibration is sound. That is such a simple statement, yet its implications are so profound. We in the West tend to minimize the importance of sound. We've lost the connection between sound, form, and vibratory consciousness. A thing is a thing because a guy named it that sometime. End of story, who cares? But perhaps sound is much more than that, as the Vedic tradition has always understood. Perhaps Nikola Tesla was onto something when he said, if you want to know the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. Perhaps we humans aren't so much material beings, but rather forms of consciousness resonating at our own timbre, uniquely individual like snowflakes, yet unified as part of the same cosmic symphony. The idea of unity through diversity reminds me of chapter 2, verse 45 of the Bhagavad Gita. I wanted to share Maharishi's commentary on this verse, as it should demonstrate one of the many reasons Maharishi attracted students around the world, namely his ability to simply explain abstract philosophical ideas. Bhagavad Gita chapter 2 verse 45 translates to, the Veda's concern is with the three gunas. Be without the three gunas, O Arjuna, freed from duality, ever firm in purity, independent of possessions, possessed of the self. Maharishi's commentary reads, this is the technique of instantaneous realization. The Lord shows Arjuna a practical way of converging the many-branched mind into the one-pointedness of the resolute intellect. Here is an effective technique for bringing the mind to a state where all differences dissolve and leave the individual in a state of fulfillment. Everything that has so far been said by Lord Krishna is to prepare Arjuna to understand this practice of bringing his mind from the field of multiplicity to that of eternal unity. This practice is to brighten all aspects of his life by bringing his mind to transcendental consciousness, the limitless source of life, energy, wisdom, peace, and happiness. It is to raise him to that cosmic status which harmonizes all the opposite forces of light. Modern psychological theories investigate causes in order to influence effects. They grope in darkness to find the cause of darkness in order to remove it. In contradiction, here is the idea of bringing light to remove darkness. This is the principle of the second element. If you wish to produce an effect on the first element, ignore that element, do not seek its cause, influence it directly by introducing a second element. Remove the darkness by introducing light. Take the mind to a field of happiness in order to relieve it of suffering. However, even if we accept that by investigating the cause, it is easy to influence the effect, we shall find that this verse will serve our purpose, for it provides a technique by which the ultimate cause of all human life can be investigated. If knowledge of the cause can help to influence the effect, then knowledge of the ultimate cause of life will effectively put an end to all suffering. The greatness of Lord Krishna's teaching lies in its direct practical approach and its completeness from every point of view. the idea of introducing a second element and the idea of investigating the cause in order to influence its effect represent two principles directly opposed to each other, yet both of them are fulfilled in one technique. It is this completeness of practical wisdom that has made the Bhagavad Gita immortal. Lord Krishna commands Arjuna, be without the three gunas, be without activity, be yourself. This is resolute consciousness, the state of absolute being, which is the ultimate cause of all causes. This state of consciousness brings harmony to the whole field of cause and effect and glorifies all life. So with that, I wish you all a state of consciousness which brings harmony to your whole field of cause and effect, a state which glorifies all of your life. Here is my friend and classmate, Gita Vedanti, reciting chapter 2, verse 45 of the Bhagavad Gita.
Traigunya Vishaya Veda Nistraigunya Bhavarjuna Nirdvando Nitya Sattvasto Niryogakshema Atmavan. The Veda's concern is with the three gunas. Be without the three gunas, O Arjuna, freed from duality, ever firm in purity, independent of possessions, possessed of the self.